My name is Alan Best, Director General from the Delian Project. I will apologize in advance that we are going with the 80% solution as far as the technological piece of this presentation. Bearing in mind, of course, that this is the first presentation after lunch. You are all full of carbohydrates, and as our German friends would say, you are going to be in a Suppenkoma, which is something to do with a sleep coma. So as part of that, we're going to try and keep this exciting. As you see before you, we have two panelists today. Very esteemed panelists that I've had the pleasure, one of whom I've known for a number of years, and the other whom I've only just met, but whose reputation precedes him. Seated to my right is Chief Justice Brian Sykes from Jamaica. He is currently the Chief Justice of that country, a very esteemed individual, graduate of the University of West Indies, a lawyer by trade, a prosecutor, including, and I won't get into the specifics of the case, but a very, very famous case in Jamaica that actually saw the removal of a judge for fraud charges. And is currently serving, as I said before, as the Chief Justice of Jamaica. To his right, Ms. Ingrid Bicu, who is a former Romanian military intelligence officer. She has been working with the Romanian Elections Commission now for a number of years and is currently seconded to International IDEA in Sweden. Can the translators hear me in the back? Am I going at a good pace? Excellent. So the topic that we have before us today is private interest during political campaigns. Similar to the other two sessions that you've seen today, I will do a very brief introduction, essentially setting the parameters, we'll say the rules of engagement for the discussion, and then I'll turn it over first to Ms. Bicu and then to the Chief Justice to offer their comments. Now, they will both be using presentations, so if we have to pause at a moment for those presentations to be set up, we will do that. Now, I do have to say, as myself and Jean-Pierre in the back being the token Canadians in the room, it is always very difficult to come to Mexico when it's 28 degrees Celsius. In fact, it's such hardship for us to leave the minus 10 degrees currently at home. So we are very, very pleased to be here. For the translators, I will say this portion in French and then I'll translate it. Pour notre collègue qui sont francophones, si vous avez des questions et vous voudrez poser les questions en français, vous pouvez faire comme ça, et moi je vais répondre en français et puis en anglais. For what I was just saying for our francophone friends is that if they do have any questions, they can pose them in French, and then I'll act as the translation for those later on. Now, these are very interesting, and they're very colorful, and they're supposed to keep the two fine people beside me in line when it comes to time, but I'm going to use moderator's privilege not to use them as the incentive. Instead, we are going to use the nectar of the gods, known as Canadian maple syrup, to keep our two colleagues online. If they go under 10 minutes, which is the timing that we're looking for, then of course they will be given the fine gifts. Ladies and gentlemen, if I can ask you to please turn within the global networking guides to page 68 if you have them. In fact, let's start at the bottom of page 67. So this is the 3 Charlie article that you'll see listed inside. At the very bottom is the definition that we're going to use for this discussion on private interest. So before I turn it over to my two esteemed colleagues, we're going to actually define how this conversation is going to take place. Often when we hear private interest, it seems to be narrowed in a very specific definition. This is certainly something we see in the larger context of the media. That is to say the private interests are somehow private sector, meaning corporations. This is absolutely not the case. So I'll read verbatim from the framework document that's going to drive this discussion. Private interests will be defined as any domestic individual and or group or corporation, as well as non-domestic special interest entities, including foreign organizations, with a vested interest in benefiting from a political campaign's outcome. Yes, that is broad, but that is intentional. As you will hear from both the Chief Justice and from Ms. Bicu, we're looking not only at the private interests and their motivation, we're also looking at some of their tools. If I can draw your attention to the screens very quickly, I think most people in the room are by now familiar with the term hybrid warfare or hybrid threat. This is the integrated use of multiple tools to try and influence a population without that population realizing they're being influenced. Some would argue it's nefarious marketing. I would submit to you that it's as old as the democratic process itself. What's different, however, is the tools that are now being used, and I'll leave it to Ms. Bicu to actually identify that piece. The next slide before you, and I'll come back to this later on in the presentation, if you look to your top left, that is the key graph to look at. That graph also appears in the documentation before you. Essentially what it identifies is the percentage of individuals based on motivation that are involved, that are private interest involved in political influence. The key number there is actually the smaller number, 12%. Most people in elections, they assume that anyone that is conducting influence activities or cyber influence activities is doing so for a political motivation or some kind of a self-interest gain. What we rarely hear about is the criminal aspect, whereby individuals are putting up nefarious posts, nefarious fake news messaging, simply to generate click-throughs on their sites and thereby generating advertising revenue. In other words, they're only doing it for money. They really couldn't care who wins the actual elections. So that's just a quick benchmark to sort of set the settings here before we go. So what I'd like to do now, without further ado, if I can ask our friends in the back to please set up the next PowerPoint presentation there for Miss Ingrid Bicu. And while that PowerPoint is being established, I'll leave the discussion with this. Once our two colleagues are done, we will open it to any commentary that wishes to come from the floor. Obviously, the microphone is open. Just put your hand up and the individual will come forward with the mic. And following that, we'll actually carry on with any questions. Ms. Bicu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alan. First of all, here they call it siesta.
Right.
But yeah, I'm very grateful to notice that there are quite a lot of people here. Thank you very much for taking the time and skipping the siesta for attending this session. Yeah, I'm going to talk about something that you've heard a lot lately during the last years, I would say, but from a little bit different perspective, having in mind my military background. Maybe this is going to be new for you because I don't want to be boring at all. So if I am, please just stop me. So yeah, the title of my presentation is Elections, a Matter of International Security, and we'll find out later, but I'm sure you assume, even from this moment, why is it the way it is. The first slide is very important. I think the most important thing that was ignored during this struggle with disinformation and cyber-enabled threats. It's only because from the very beginning, the responsible, I don't know if we managed to identify those, but the responsible institutions, let's say, or the actors were not able to make a clear difference between cyber threats and the cyber-enabled information operations. When we're talking about cyber threats, we're talking about the threats that target the hard part of the cyber environment. And then when we're talking about information operations, we're talking about that kind of manipulation, disinformation, propaganda, whatever we can, whatever word we can use for it, that uses the social media platforms and the online environment in order to reach its goal. They are quite different, I would say. I would dare to say almost totally different in terms of the resources allocated, human resources, meaning we're talking about cybersecurity experts on one side and strategic communication experts on the other side. Then it's different when it comes to regulation and also to education, obviously. One is cyber hygiene, that teaches us how to keep ourselves safe when it comes to hard part, to cyber security. And the other one is media literacy, understanding of online algorithms, keeping ourselves safe and securing our data, being responsible with our data. This being said, well, this is a slide that I'm sure you don't need it. It's just something that it's my personal approach here. I don't know if you agree or if the researchers agree with my perspective. What I say is that the new media is not new since 20 years ago. Actually, it used to be new at that point, but now we're talking about online media. So this slide is about how everything started 20 years ago, almost, as I said, with Wikipedia, let's say, but not so threatening. Even though Wikipedia itself has also some biases. I'm not sure if you're aware of those, but that's another topic. And then we have, of course, Facebook, YouTube. By the way, during the sessions that we had here, especially the ones that were concerning social media, YouTube was some sort of ignored for some reason. The problem is that according to the studies, YouTube seems to be, and of course, keeping in mind the deepfake threat. YouTube seems to be the next war battle, should I say. So yeah, we have to be aware of that. And we have all the platforms. I will not insist on this. Sorry. Okay. Now just a work, of the way information goes, the online voter information flow, or it can be disinformation depending on the interest, because as you know, information operations can be white, gray, black, whatever color they might have in between, depending on the target. So you can have good intentions with those. And we're talking here about, for example, the strategies that electoral management bodies can have in order to inform voters on the procedures and things like that. And then you can have the rest of manipulation and propaganda campaigns that are more like to the gray and black part of the information operations. Okay, let me see if I can go to the next. Well, a lot of people are moving around, so it's a little bit difficult to focus. The question was why, and Ellen answered to it at the very beginning. So my intention was to somehow ask you in the public if you have any answer for that, but we can still do this. I have a very interesting example. I don't know if you mentioned it, but it's the hobby. I think it's the only one you didn't mention. We have a case, actually, an interesting case in Romania of a gentleman who had a hobby for the American policy, and then when the first time he saw Trump speaking, he thought that it's not from the normal landscape of it's not from the normal American political landscape, and he simply decided to support him just for that, because he had a hobby. And then he created a website. It was called, very interesting, endingthefed.com. And he started generating and sharing news, fake news, about Trump in order to support him to win, because his target was to help Trump win the American elections. The problem is that this gentleman generated like 3 million reactions on social media. And then when he has been interviewed by the intelligence services, by the commissions that were in charge with checking what was the problem and what was his interest, he just said that he has nothing to do with WikiLeaks, with Russians, with anyone. He didn't earn any money. His only objective was to have some fun in the afternoons. So yeah, we do have this category also, a little bit dangerous, I would say. Who? Well, again, it had been said by Ellen at the very beginning, and to connect with this session, I think we have to include political parties. We're starting to discuss more and more about, of course, we will never forget the external entities. We have to keep them in mind and be very aware, especially from a strategic and military perspective. But we do have the internal ones, the political parties, who, according to recent studies, seems to be quite big players in the field of disinformation. So, but if you have, again, any other ideas, any other entities that were not mentioned, and do you think they worth being mentioned, please. Now, how? This is a question that I really like to ask, because of course we have the social media platforms as the battlefield, as I said, as the environment, or the online environment in general as a battlefield. But then you have those sociological methods and tools and the cognitive biases, and these are two things that people don't take into consideration almost at all when they speak about manipulation and propaganda. And actually, in Mein Kampf, it's very well described, if I'm not wrong, the way propaganda works. So maybe it would be very useful not only for the people who are implementing these propaganda techniques to know how to do it, but also for us to know how it works in order to avoid becoming victims. And I will make a very brief, something happened. Well, it was not about thank you. Okay. Good, almost. So, overtone windows, that's one of the techniques I would like to briefly present to you, because I'm not sure you're familiar with it, and it might sound new and it might help you understand how things work. And it's about identifying a suitable moment in the social, political landscape to raise an issue that apparently is impossible. And then you go through all the processes from impossible to debating the idea amongst specialists who present it as radical, but not something that cannot be reached. And then the next step would be to present the idea as being acceptable by the influencers and opinion trainers. And again, getting to the next step, it becomes rational, and that's the point where media and these days social media has a very important role when it comes to manipulating the audience. So basically the idea is being presented as a rational solution, and it's using, there are being used rational arguments for and against it in order to make the debate as, let's say, real as possible. And as soon as the idea becomes popular, then they are using half-truths to support it, and eventually it is presented as a political opportunity and is being implemented, excuse me, can you still hear me? Yeah. And adopted by the society. It might sound familiar to you if you think a little bit on our international landscape these days. So it was just to familiarize you with one of the propaganda and manipulation techniques. There are various, of course, and especially in the military field, many more. Yeah. The next point would be, again, having in mind the previous techniques that were discussed. The epistemic bubbles and the echo chambers. So after we've been influenced, after we've been through all those steps, and that idea has been inoculated to us, we're either in an epistemic bubble or in an echo chamber. And now the debate is which of the two is more problematic, let's say. Because when we're talking about epistemic bubbles, the people who are inside are not exposed to people from the opposite side. Well, again, the debate is, and there are researchers who say that actually every person is somehow, in a certain context, exposed to some other opinions. The only problem is, speaking about cognitive biases, is that our brain does much less effort accepting information that is in line with our own beliefs. And in this situation, this enables the propagandists, the people interested in influencing us, this is making things much easier for them. And not only for them, but when we're talking about social media and the way social media algorithms work, and then if you think that it's about, it was about neuromarketing at the beginning, and the purpose of social media platforms when they started targeting us was to sell us products, not ideology, not political orientation or things like that, then you will understand that we're somehow targeted based on our own and having in mind our own cognitive biases. And then, but this might be the good part, because when you're part of an epistemic bubble, then it means that if you're exposed to the opposite opinion or to some opposite arguments, you might get out of that. But when we talk about echo chambers, where here we find people who distrust everybody on the outside. And when we talk about trust and distrust, the problem becomes much more difficult, because we all know that gaining trust is the most difficult thing that a state institution, for example, has to do and can do. And we're now all facing all over the world an endemic distrust in public institutions. So this might be an issue that should somehow be addressed or at least developed. I will go to the next slide because I think Ellen eventually might use that things. I'm close to it, right? Yeah, we were talking about the informational flooding, which is basically a consequence of receiving all those information on all the social media and online, actually in all environments, because we still have, for example in Romania, I think 50% of the people are still getting their information from the TV. Of course, there are differences when it comes to age, but yeah, it's still from there. So we end up being flooded with this huge volume of contradictory information, and we either don't vote anymore, or we're manipulated, we're the victims of this propaganda, and we end up um, going or deciding the fate of our nation in a way that would badly influence the future of, let's say, some generations. And I hope I'm exaggerating, actually. So as a finding, the truth is that, and this is something that, it was a finding that we had as intelligence services, because we were able to access more information, but it was much more difficult to structure it and to use it and to analyze it, since we didn't have all the, let's say, the technological instruments that we're now developing. Now the question is, what's the solution? Regulation, education, both. And, well, it has been, let's say, decided. Even International IDEA has a cybersecurity policy paper that has been issued a few months ago that concludes that interagency collaboration is the key for dealing with cybersecurity. But now the question is, and the debate is much more intense when it comes to the social media, to the online environment. So, the Canadian Marshall McLuhan, who talked about the world as our village, as our global village. Well, this is what we're trying, but I'm the only one seeing it. This is what we're trying to regulate. I'm sorry I did not have time to update it, to update this map, but it's from March 2019. I'm pretty sure that the numbers are even higher at this point. So this is the world internet. We have almost 200 countries in the world. The question is, will we have 200 internets in the world following the regulation of internet? Do we want to have this? The debate is quite intense on this, and we should keep in mind all these numbers when we're thinking about regulating the online environment. What we currently see are attempts by states to create territorial control of internet, a category of public who wants more social platform regulation. We have also another category of public who pledges for defending freedom of expression, democracy and human rights, given the fact that it's the 8th consecutive year where the online environment is shrinking. And the weak ability of states to do this in public interest. I have to finish as soon as possible. Someone is falling asleep. Yeah, for more worrying trends in internet governance, there are policy panic, policy profiteering, policy opportunism, and policy perversion. It's about the fact that some states are trying to deal with this as soon as possible, and they are implementing some inefficient regulations. Some other states are pointing towards Western states who are implementing regulation in order to censor more and to implement measures that shrink even more the civic space and the online environment. And I'm not going to insist on the other ones. Now, the solution for this, if you're asking me, and well, I'm sure people try to find some other solutions, but the main solution is the critical thinking. And having in mind the fact that there are some concepts that Ellen and I used to know very well some time ago, but we were the only ones who were using them. And now, every single voter should be able, and every single person in the world should be able to assess the information and make decisions informed. So source validation, reliable source, primary source, multiple source information verification source system. There are some concepts that I won't speak about now, but if you have questions, please feel free to ask. Well, the useful idiots, I'm sure it's a concept that you might know. Most of us, at least once, it happened to any of us to share information, a false information, an information that had nothing to do with the truth, but we still behaved this way because we did not have the background and the critical thinking abilities that unfortunately were not developed to people that come from former communist regimes. And it might sound familiar to you, the fact that we were not allowed to think out of the box, we were not allowed to have opinions, we were not allowed to ask questions, because this used to sound weird for the people for the big brother. So this is another thing that adds to the challenges. I'm done. Okay, I won't receive it anymore, I'm sorry. who wants the maple syrup can have it. A simple critical thinking exercise would be to ask ourselves every time we receive an information, we read an information, what is the primary source, who benefits from spreading it, to whom can it cause harm, what would be the counter-arguments, is the topic a false problem? I know, given the huge amount of information, it's going to be very difficult for us to question ourselves every time we want to share an information, but maybe we should limit the share also. I'm not going to speak about this. The intelligence cycle is the biggest part of this presentation, but maybe I will need another invitation to another event. Yeah, I'm done. My suggestion is just to follow. The intelligence cycle is about planning, collecting, processing, analyzing, and then making decisions, informed decisions. And this is the suggestion for all the normal people, not only for the ones coming from the military environment. If you have any forecasts, I would be happy to know and to discuss about them. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ms. Biku. As you saw in her presentation, coming from a military background, once upon a time, things were very much in the stovepipe. In other words, they were kept just within that institution that was either the military or the security sector. If I can ask for the next presentation to be set up, please, for the Chief Justice. While that's happening, just to finish up on what I was saying, we no longer have the luxury to live in silos, or as we used to cynically say, cylinders of excellence. We need that broad approach and that whole of government approach to be able to identify not only who the private interests are, but then how to counter the threats that are currently coming, which Ms. Biku so excellently articulated. I'd now like to turn the floor over to Chief Justice Sykes, who will give us his perspective, coming very much from a legal framework and a legal background. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And here the technology is a bit distressing at the moment, but we'll work with it. It's not responding here.
If you can grab the PowerPoint presentation.
I need to get over onto the one called the race. And so for those of, while that is happening, so click on the one marked the race, please. And so while that is going on, for those of you who have this book, those of you who have it, let us turn to page 72. And I'll eventually get back to there, and particularly the third paragraph, the paragraph that begins, Sweden's September 2018 national election. And if they could click on the one marked the race. Yes? It's not happening? No, the other one. You have to go back. Right, the one marked the race. Yes. Right, and then now the first one there, Usain Bolt. The YouTube link.
969 in winning the gold medal in the men's 100 meters. And he celebrates deservedly with the Jamaican contingent in the Bird's Nest Stadium. 100 meters final has always provided some of the most memorable moments in the Olympics over the years, from Ben Johnson in Seoul to Donovan Bailey in Atlanta, and Beijing 2008 promised an amazing night as well. Consider the field. World champion Tyson Gay didn't make it through to the semis. Usain Bolt is the world's fastest man. Asafa Powell, certainly a contender, but this man, Richard Thompson, looked very good in the qualifying. Others, probably not as impressive as Bolt, Powell, and Thompson. Bolt is the current world's fastest man going in, lowering the world record to 9.72 in New York in June of this year. But would the Olympics be too big a stage for him? Would it affect his performance? Once they're away, it seems Bolt did not get a great start, but very quickly, those long strides carry him to the lead. At 50 meters, he has run away from the field. At 80 meters, he was able to...
Go to the next one. So in other words, an election is all about a race.
Go Bolt.
Yes. So let's go back to the next one. The one with Shelley and Fraser Price. Yes, Shelley, the one below Bolt, click on that one.
The women's 100 meters World Championship final. It's a clean start. There's a roar from the crowd. Shelley-Ann Fraser-Price gets a good start. Dina Asher-Smith going well. Fraser-Price is going to get there. What a performance. Fraser-Price, and it's silver for Dina Asher-Smith.
And then the next one now with the famous Mexican walk race champion. Yes, that one. Yes. There she is, winning her gold medal.
This is on track to be the closest finish of the weekend so far as Gonzalez strides past Morhon. Morhon, has she got anything to respond with? Gonzalez has produced a brilliant last lap here.
And then go back now to democracy and why it matters. And so the point is, elections are all about races, whether it's a first past the post system, whether it's a proportional representational system. Elections are about political parties who seek to gain power and to keep it, because unless they do that, they are not able to implement their policies. That is really what separates political parties from pressure groups or advocacy groups. And so now, whether you're a sprinter, male, female, or it's an endurance, because for some elections, especially in the Westminster model system where my country is based on, you have situations in which, since we don't have a fixed election date, the Prime Minister can call the election literally at any time. And he does it, obviously, when he thinks he's best favored politically in terms of winning again. So sometimes the elections are very short, and it's like a very short sprint like the 100 meters. At other times, they may decide to run down the clock and go to the full term. And so the election campaign usually begins unofficially about a year before the elections are called, and then you have the gradual build-up. And so it's almost an endurance race right down to the end. And so if you go to the very first bubble, that is to go back to, yes, democracy and why it matters. Right. And so now, it is a very important aspect of our lives, particularly in this part of the world where democracy is new to some countries in this region and is still endeavoring to take root. And so why is this important? I refer to the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. That is from the preamble, and it is making the point that we're dealing with the inherent dignity and equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. And one of those foundational rights, which we click on ICCPR preamble, if you click on that one, please. Or the other one. Go back. Back. Top. Yes. Thank you. And so now it speaks of the ideal of free human beings enjoying civil and political freedom, and freedom from fear and want can only be achieved if conditions are created whereby everyone may enjoy his civil and political rights as well as his economic, social, and cultural rights. And I emphasize this to put the whole business of elections in an international context, not just something that's happening within the boundaries of a particular territory, but there's an international dimension to it as well. And if you go back out of that bubble and go to the next one, yes, back, and the one, yes, next there, yes. And so there you see Article 25. This was referenced by one of the speakers in plenary yesterday, and I'm borrowing that and emphasizing it here, where it speaks to the right of and the opportunity. So it speaks to both things, the right and the opportunity, because sometimes you have the right, but the opportunity is not really there. So both of them are fundamental and important. And so we speak about the right and opportunity without any distinction or mentioned in Article 2, to take part in the conduct of public affairs directly or through freely chosen representatives. And here we are getting now to really what I would call in the covenant without any distinction, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, and so on. And it speaks about effective remedies. So it is really speaking to inclusiveness and diversity within the domestic space, so that within our country, sometimes we have issues relating to democracy where political actors may take the view that this group or that group should not be part of the process or be allowed to participate fully. And so here we have now the international context saying that really the state has an obligation to provide the opportunity for them to take part and actually ensure that it can be effectively exercised by the persons within the particular country. And so if you approach it like that, it really solves a lot of problems, I think, conceptually and intellectually. And so whenever you're having, I suggest, some difficulties within your national boundaries, you can always go back to this convention and have a look at it and see what it says and look how broad and inclusive its language is. So the question of minority groups, the question of persons with disabilities, question of women, the question of gender issues, all of those are addressed because they are all living within some domestic boundary, and therefore, from that standpoint alone, should be able to participate in the national life of the country, whether as representatives or electors. So let us go back out of that bubble then. Back, please. Yes. And then the third one. Yes. Which brings us now, when we're talking about elections. The fact of the matter is that elections are expensive, whether in an absolute sense or in a relative sense. You can't get away from it. And so you have to have campaigns. This is the way by which persons get their views out. So even if they are in the minority, even if they are not liked, they still have the right, provided, of course, they're not infringing other people's rights and behaving in absolutely obnoxious ways. They have the right to get their views out. So how are they going to do this? It takes money. Advertisements, there's radio, there's TV, there's print, there's Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, and so on. Meeting persons, depending on where you are in the development continuum. In many developing countries, many of our people like to see the candidates. They like to get close to them, shake hands, kiss the babies, and so on. And even in developed societies, not that I'm advocating one way or the other, but it is said, at least a couple of the books that I have read, that one of the reasons why Mrs. Clinton didn't do as well as she could have done was that she was not out and about, particularly the three key states that Mr. Trump won, meeting and greeting the persons there. And so they either stayed home or the highly motivated ones that went out went to vote for Mr. Trump. So in the context of elections, then, going out and meeting persons, so you have to have handlers, you have to have drivers, you have to have all sorts of people to support that kind of activity. And then you have to tailor your message to the different groups within the society. And in countries where you have large populations and you have diversity within the population, you have to tailor your message to meet the group at where they are, to encourage them to participate in the process. And all of that is expensive. It takes money. So that money in election campaigns is inevitable. And lots of it is inevitable, especially if it's a national campaign. It's a local government, takes some money, but not as much. But if it's a national campaign where they're running for the presidency or to be a prime minister, it takes a lot of money. And the way you find that in some countries we have transportation difficulties, some of the voters may live in really almost inaccessible areas, you still have to get there. And then you have the meet and greet. Walking along the street, hi, how are you? I'm John Brown, I'm running for office. I want to be a congressman, prime minister, and so on. And so all of that takes money. And so if you come out of that bubble and go down to the next one. So I'm trying to get my maple syrup.
I've lost it.
Yes. And so now, question of Who pays? Is it free speech or preventing corruption? Because of the money that comes into it, and lots of money coming into it now, is it, so when a person decides to fund a particular candidate, is it an exercise of free speech as is suggested out of some of the cases coming out of the US Supreme Court? When you regulate it, are you preventing corruption or are you inhibiting free speech? And that is always the dilemma when you talk about regulation. What is it that you're actually regulating? And we have to take account of the unintended consequences of whenever we are regulating. And I think this is one of the things that came out of the citizens, what was in the famous case coming out of the US Supreme Court? The Citizens United against the elections. I mean, what was interesting about that case is that they were the ones who took the preemptive action, because it wasn't that the Federal Election Commission brought an action against them. It was they who went to court to say, look, this is what I wish to do, and I fear that the Election Commission may say something about it. And so they were asking the court to prevent the Election Commission from interfering with them. And so that is how the case actually got into court. And eventually the court was not too happy with some aspects of the legislation and said that even though they took the general point, but they're saying that one of the consequences was that you would be inhibiting free speech, and free speech is fundamental to a democracy. Certainly in my country, Jamaica, coming from the British tradition, what we see in our country is a gradual regulation of political parties. So up until the mid-1970s, you didn't have to be registered. Well, mid-90s, yes, and early 2000s, you could just simply get up one day and say, well, you know what? All right, come Alan, come Ingrid, let us form a political party, and you go out and you campaign. Now they are saying you need to be registered, and then once you are registered now, which you have to be, then you now fall within the campaign finance laws. The statute was passed in 2016, it became law last year. So our next elections in 2021 will be the first general election where this new finance campaign law will be in effect, and so we'll see how it works. And essentially what it's trying to do is to regulate how money is contributed to the political parties. And I suppose the idea being you want to keep out dirty money, because the legislation has within it provisions that bar contributions from what they call improper parties. So it is seeking to keep out dirty money and then to put a cap on how much of quote-unquote clean money can come into the campaign. The deficiency there, however, is that it only applies during the campaign period. So if you're outside the campaign period, immediately any lawyer worth his salt reading the legislation would begin to say, okay, let us begin to build up our war chest before we get into the campaign period. And the statute has a provision where you can opt out in certain instances where you can actually say, look, I need no money from the national fund that has been set up here. I will do my own thing. So that's a weakness here. I would call our legislation what I call the first generation campaign finance laws or campaign regulation. What was highlighted by Ingrid is the more sophisticated end of it, where you're getting into the influence by private actors, and in the broad sense, not restricted now to companies and that kind of thing, but essentially anyone who wishes to influence the election improperly and not using the legitimate means you could put into that category. And I think that was the point coming out of the article that you were directed to by Alan. And so now, in all of that, what do we do? And this is why I directed you to page 72, because at the end of the day in a democracy, it really doesn't matter how much laws you have, especially when it comes to the dissemination of information. It really doesn't matter. You could have the most wonderful laws on the books, and some of them will take significant sums of money to enforce. So for example, let us look at the experience of the United States to come up with the conclusion that Russia was interfering with the elections. What did they have? They had the CIA, they had the FBI, with all of the available resources. Many developing countries simply don't have those resources. We simply don't. But we are vulnerable. So what do we do? Education. And so that is what page 72 is about. And I would want to suggest that they have presented a model here that many developing democracies, emerging democracies, can use to deal with this threat of misinformation and disinformation. Begin in advance to educate your population about it, its effects, its possible sources, and why it is such a distorting influence, because what it does is really undermining the capacity and the right of the citizen to participate in free and fair elections. And so I believe I have received my maple syrup. Thank you very much.
Not yet, Chief Justice. We're not done. Thank you very much. I do want to point out, actually, if you look at the article on page 72, the Swedish example, Michael, if you can stand up in the back, we do actually have a representative from the Swedish Election Commission here. So if any of you have any questions afterwards, feel free to speak to him. He's also a newly elected member of Parliament, so be gentle. Thank you very much, Chief Justice. Obviously, thank you very much, Ms. Biku. What we'll do now is if there's anyone that wishes to have their comments put on the record, that wishes to make a statement, I would ask that you please keep your comments to no more than 3 minutes in the interest of brevity, so that we can then open it up for any questions for our actual speakers. So does anyone wish to make a comment at this time? Sir, if we can get a microphone for the gentleman.
This is a question. Like, you said, Ingrid, it is the way it has to be regulated, the way media is regulated in terms of social media. So in terms of regular media, for example, it is a print media, and we know who prints that, which company is that, who is the editor. So, and you have a contact, and it is originated in that particular country. Social media has the origin elsewhere, beyond your reach. So how that situation to be handled? One, should they be compelled to register in a country, for example, like my country, Nepal, YouTube, should they be registered in, otherwise how they find out? Because where to send the summon by the Election Commission to whom? How they would be called in a platform to be invited by the Election Commission to talk what to publish or what not to publish. Is there any model, is there any experience elsewhere developed?
Are we answering now or taking some more questions? Okay. So the point with social media is that even at the beginning of the internet, I think the main domain, I don't remember exactly the extension, but it was a very weird extension, and it was somewhere on an island of the Pacific. So it's the effect of globalization. You cannot oblige anyone to do anything in a certain place, in a certain country. Again, it's going to be segmented. What social media platforms and somehow their business model should change in a way that they should be consistent in applying the regulations. It's not fair and it's not correct having in Europe GDPR and they behaving in terms of respecting that, and then when we talk about countries elsewhere, they are not supposed to respect the same rules. I think it's less about what they should do. It's some sort of a collaboration. Let's say that if we manage to draw some very clear international general guidelines, and then the national states can adapt them and translate them into a legislation, then the things can be much easier. But otherwise, we're facing those threats of excessive abuse of abuse, excuse me, it's a pleonasm, of abuse from certain states when it comes to regulation. And when it comes to the way political parties spend their money in the online environment, well, there are two sides. So one of them is having as much transparency as possible from media platforms in terms of who is being targeted, why is being targeted, having the option and the possibility. And this is something that the Netherlands, for example, wants to implement. So every I hope I'm not saying something wrong, but at every 50 people that are being targeted by a political ad, by a political advertisement, 50 more people randomly chosen should be exposed to the same. Or vice versa. For example, if, well, let me remember exactly because I noted here. Yeah, exactly. So if a person is being targeted, given her certain particularities, her profile, then another person that's somehow opposite or totally different from that person's view should also be targeted by the same ad. That's the idea that I promoted previously in my presentation, the idea of getting out of our bubbles. Okay, so having the opportunity to expose ourselves. And then if I'm not a big fan of social media regulation, of the internet, of regulation the internet and in general, because I think the main effect is going to be restricting the freedom of expression. When it comes to political party financing, I think there's a lot of room for regulation. And there's another possibility that I don't know if it is actually a possibility in all the countries, but states can actually provide subvention or reimburse political campaign expenses. And in this case, the political parties are required under some very strict regulation to be transparent on their expenses. And this way we have both equality when it comes to reaching the electorate and a control on what political parties are doing with the money. So it's a two-side solution, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, just picking up on the point about the financing of political parties, under our system in Jamaica, the new law hasn't yet been tested in terms of cases in court, but it is suggesting again that you should essentially identify the source. Essentially one of the things that it does, ask you to identify the source from which the contribution is coming. But the legislation, and I suppose understandably, could not deal with, for example, issue-based, I call it financing, for want of a better word, where suppose you have a particular party that promotes a particular issue, and you may wish to favor that political party, but you can do it in a way without collaborating with the party explicitly by having your own views being expressed that just so happen to coincide with the particular political party that you favor. So there's not necessarily any collusion. So you can go about influencing public opinion in that way, and you're not necessarily regarded by our legislation as a political actor. You can just simply say, I'm a civil society group, and I am just merely expressing my views in the democracy, as is everybody. The fact that it happens to coincide with political party is just purely a coincidental matter. And so that's why I come back to the point of education, because the thing about legislation is that you're always going to be behind whatever it is that you are trying to regulate. Because regulation is oftentimes in response to something that has happened and trying to prevent a reoccurrence, as distinct from legislating forward into the unknown. And so by the time you get onto this behavior, and the whole legislative process is gone through, some other behavior has come up that the legislation doesn't deal with. And so you're going to be always in this mode of catching up. And so I think it really comes back round to educating your population, dealing to identify fake news, disinformation, just to become aware of it and assisting them in becoming more critical. Because democracies, by definition, are open. They're open societies. And so it is difficult to regulate and over-regulate in the context of a democracy where you wish to have free and open debate about issues. And so education of your population, for me, is actually fundamental and vital.
Thank you to you both. That was in response, obviously, to our esteemed friend from Nepal, given the fact it was a question. I think it was a bit, yeah. Oh, do you want to comment on that there, Ilona?
I don't think what.
Okay.
To be honest, I don't know what this is, whether it's a comment or a question. And I'm not sure if I'm supposed to ask it now or just now.
Please, by all means.
So I'll go and ask it. Well, a couple of things. One is there's talk of regulating the space out there.
Yes.
And in response to the question from the gentleman from Nepal, and I know, I mean, Facebook has now come out and said, give us the regulations or help us. But my question is a couple of who regulates it? I mean, we have to initiate it from somewhere. And whose responsibility is it? Even if you're talking about first an international regulation and then you, which we've done with all these conventions, and then you domesticate it. Who actually does that? And who should initiate that? Because we've been talking about it for some time and still nothing has happened. So I'm just wondering how much longer. And then just a question on education. I absolutely agree. The more people know, the more they can make an informed choice in a way. But there's been a lot of education on a lot of issues. For example, if you take the issue of HIV and AIDS, I mean, there are loads of money has been poured into countries across the world, but then there are other factors. Why do young girls and boys, or especially young girls who know the consequence, it's economic, it's poverty, it's et cetera, so there's still a whole lot of other factors around that. I'm not quite sure, how it would really work. I mean, somehow or other, I think often as people, we choose to be uneducated. Doesn't matter how much education there is out there, we choose not to. The other issue I wanted to also ask about is, once you've been targeted, for example, a candidate, it's very difficult to turn it around. Because you've now got to say, well, I never said that or I never did that. Just in the print media, somebody says something and you get an apology this big and nobody looks at it anyway. I don't know how we do that, because it's a very effective weapon against an opposition. And then the issue again, for the media, codes of conduct are drawn up. You have independent media bodies, and it's easier to regulate it, even if they'll still abuse it. It's still easier to engage with the print media. And I'm sure it'll still come in time. I'm just trying to wrap my head around how do we do it virtually? Mm-hmm. Because I don't know how that happens or how we see it happening. Thank you.
If I may, for our esteemed friend from South Africa, Ilona, that's 3 significant questions there. So in terms of the social media piece, who regulates, how do we educate, and then when it comes to the actual politicians, the targeting, and what are the codes of conduct? That is a very loaded question that I'm sure our colleagues want to answer. So before I open it to them, is there anyone else that wants to make a commentary? Because I think this is gonna take up some time to answer. So is there anyone else that wishes to make a commentary at this time on the record before we answer Ilona's questions? No? Okay. Oh, sorry, one in the back.
Sí, buenas tardes. Yo soy un ciudadano colombiano bastante neófito en todos estos temas, un poco alejado de todo lo que tiene que ver con esto del Facebook, de todas esas cosas. Sin embargo, me parece que la cosa termina siendo más elemental de lo que se puede pensar. En principio, estoy de acuerdo con lo que dice nuestro señor representante de Jamaica. O sea, yo creo que siempre buscamos las soluciones en la regulación y en la legislación. Y como bien lo dice él, generalmente eso llega tarde y no es la solución para los problemas. Más allá de eso, tenemos que pensar en medios sencillos. Cuando uno está creando a sus hijos y los hijos empiezan a meterse en internet a ver todas las cosas, ¿uno qué le dice a los hijos? Le dice, oiga, como hay una expresión en derecho que dice, reciba eso con beneficio de inventario. Es decir, todo lo que hay ahí no es cierto, todo lo que aparece ahí no es verdad. Entonces tiene que tener un sentido crítico, es la educación. Entonces la educación, que es un tema bien complicado, pues arranca desde la casa y arranca desde que tenemos a nuestros hijos. Y claro, se aplica tanto en los medios tradicionales como en los medios de comunicación extensiva o globalizada. Es que esta cosa es tan simple como cómo controla uno los chismes en su barrio, cómo los controla. Pues no los puede controlar, la gente lanza eso y uno simplemente o le cree o no le cree. Ahí está la educación, tenga sentido crítico, reciba todo con cuidado, con beneficio de inventario. Pero regular, ¿cómo regula uno algo donde se supone que hay libertad de expresión? Por eso los medios se autorregulan, es lo que se dice, que se autorregulen. ¿Por qué? Porque es que si se regulan, se entiende eso como un ataque a la libertad de expresión y al principio democrático. Entonces solo quería decir eso. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
If I may take the first question asked by a colleague from South Africa. In the democratic space, I don't think my country is any different from yours. Politicians rarely do things that restrict their power. They really enact laws. The pressure has to come from somewhere outside of the parliament, outside of the political parties. And this is where now the role of civil society groups can come in. In the case of Jamaica, the question of financing of political parties, it took somewhere between 10 to 17 years of debate, pressure for the consensus to get to the point where the political parties, the lawmakers, could not ignore it anymore. And so one of the interesting things about democracies is that it's hard work. You don't just simply turn up to a parliamentarian or a lawmaker and say, you know, I wish you to pass this law because I think it is good. It just isn't going to happen just like that. Sometimes the pressure has to be brought. And you have to be making the argument within the society itself, because sometimes when you begin to make the argument, people are saying, well, what are you talking about? I'll use an example again from Jamaica of human trafficking. Most persons in Jamaica didn't know about human trafficking. So when the United States said human trafficking is taking place in Jamaica, many Jamaicans were saying, but what are these people talking about? I don't know of any human trafficking. You know any human trafficker? But as the education process began and people became more aware, they said, oh, well, maybe human trafficking has been taking place here. And so that is the point. So it has to start with perhaps a civil society group. You may have a sympathetic lawmaker who may wish to take up the cause. But in some instances, especially if it will have an impact on the power of political parties, they may not necessarily be your first choice persons to go to. And so that is how you have to build consensus within the society until you get to the point where it becomes in the interest of the lawmakers to look at the particular bit of legislation or whatever it is that you wish to do. Mm-hmm. Yes. A lot.
Yeah, I think, again, it needs to be made a very clear separation between things. So because we have all these types of things that we want to regulate, and of types of disinformation, I would not say types, but we have the different entities, the different objectives, the different outcomes. When we're talking about foreign interference of a state or of a company on our elections, it's a question of national security that should be addressed by the national agencies in collaboration with the foreign agencies. It's something that has to be done, and it has been proven that it's somehow the way you deal with this. And then, when we're talking about national actors, when we're talking about political parties, when we talk about individuals, they are easy to spot. And of course, you can always go against them. When we're talking about political parties, and there is the place, and there is room for regulation. So I'm not talking at all about regulating the internet. That's what I would like to emphasize again. There, I totally agree. It's about critical thinking. It's about education. Even when we talk about critical thinking and education, as it has been said in the session, and very well said actually in the session about social media, you might not be targeting the right public, because we already know that the generation that grew with technology is kind of aware on what's happening and what they are exposed to. But when we're talking with like the middle-aged people and even older, they are the target. And there are studies who basically confirm that the people who think more that they would never be a target of disinformation are the ones that will most probably become victims. So we have all this context, and I think we have to be very careful and to segment the problem and address the segmented problems, and not everything as a whole. We're not talking about cyber We're talking about very, very, very special situations that should be addressed in a very specific manner. So I'm a big fan of education, and I totally agree with it. I think, and I'm trying to understand as much as possible from the phenomenon, and the more I think, the more I realize that there's nothing else but education. And maybe we don't want anything else. I mean, do you want I don't know, a legislator to tell you what should you see on your social media wall? Well, I don't. I consider myself capable of choosing. So I don't want any type of regulation. And maybe I wanna read disinformation news. I have friends who do this. I mean, I myself read outlets and media outlets that I know they are disinforming, just to be exposed to everything. It's our right, freedom of expression, freedom of information. We're not restricting that. But when it comes to political, with corruption and political financing, there's plenty of room for regulation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, Jean-Pierre, question in the back.
It amazes me how we're bespoken by the idea of the internet being this thing that has no obligation whatsoever. Am I okay now? Thank you. So why is the internet viewed in such terms? You may wish to look at what you want, Bridget, but if they're going to be talking about me and calling me a child abuser, I want to be able to go after them. I want to know who they are. If they do that in a newspaper, we've covered that already, so why can't we do that as well? Because we do not know who is putting it on the web. We allow anonymity where we should not allow anonymity. If we're able to trace, now the other thing too is they will say, well, it's coming from another country and therefore we cannot control it, we're just a distributor. Well, you cannot be that way. If you're robbing a bank and you're just a car driver, we've always assumed the car driver is as guilty as the persons who go into the bank to rob the bank. And we allow ourselves to be smartened by the idea that it's the internet and therefore we cannot do anything. Mm-hmm. I think we can do things. Now, that's one side. Now, with respect to advertising, free speech is free so long as it is reasonable that it is free. If I'm spending 20 times as much as my opponent during an election campaign, I think I've increased my chances of success significantly. As a matter of fact, quite significantly. And you can only get free speech if there's a maximum to what I can say and what somebody else can say, so that we're being reasonable in how we access the media. So in my mind, it's not unreasonable to say you cannot spend as much as you want. And you cannot say to someone who's outside of the game, you can spend as much as you want because it's free speech. Now, this is the definition of free speech, the Supreme Court in the United States. Money is free speech. And I will use the example of Canada. In Canada, we say it is free only so long as it is reasonable and everyone has relatively equal access to it, and there's a limit to it. So I'm using this as an example because if you do control that, then you will be able to control the advertising side of these interveners who are from outside. So you've covered both sides of the new mechanisms called the internet. If they're doing something with advertising, they have to register, you have to know who they are, and there's a limit to what they can do. Mm-hmm. And on the internet, as I was saying, tell me who you are, so that Canadians or the people can know who you are saying these things about these candidates and about these political parties, or about me as an individual, so I can come after you with the full force of law if you're saying something which is false. Because I will want your nitty-gritty for stake. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. We have 5 minutes left, sir, so if you can just do a quick follow-up. Yeah.
Like, in a democratic society, freedom of speech can be limited if it, hits the personal reputation, spreads the hate against the race, and it processes the concerns in the national security. There are some exceptions. So would be the case with the internet. in a democratic society, I'm telling, yeah, not in other society. So I think, internet are not beyond those limitations. So there has to be some, guidelines based on those, freedom of speech exceptions.
Thank you very much. In terms of regulation, the analogy we use at home is that every young kid at school in Canada is taught you cannot yell fire in a movie theater. Is that inhibiting free speech? We're down to the very end now. So what I will do is I will offer 2 minutes each to our esteemed colleagues here if they want to do a quick summary before we adjourn.
I don't think, thank you very much for listening. Let me begin there, and for our moderator and my co-presenter here, Ms. Biko. This has been a wonderful opportunity for me to meet these two persons and to meet all of you. But what I will say, not just in relation to this, but generally about this conference, this is the third year that I have been coming here, and I must tell you that I did not really give as much thought to these things before I started coming here. So to that extent, I have found this quite a useful exercise, and it has also opened my eyes to a lot of aspects to democracy that when you're a judge sitting in court from day to day, you don't really have the opportunity to think about these things. So I wish to thank the organizers for creating this forum where we can come together as both on the regulatory side, whether from an electoral commission, and also as judicial officers, also as interested non-governmental organizations. And what we are doing here is really enhancing, thinking of ways and means of enhancing and fostering democracy. And I like the environment where we can all meet. There's no political agenda. Nobody is trying to get you to condemn this person or to take this particular position. It is really meeting in a free and open space to exchange ideas, and may this conference grow and expand, because I think it is really a necessary forum, and it is now filling an important gap. I call it in the international calendar, where we can meet to discuss issues relating to democracy and all its dimensions and aspects. So that is what I have to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I will not repeat what the Justice said, because it's obviously that all the people here and all of us who had the opportunity to speak or to moderate are very grateful to the organizers for this wonderful event. Yeah, well, I was hoping after every single event that I attend on disinformation, misinformation, manipulation, propaganda, whatever, I kind of hope that we'll get to a conclusion. And I don't think we will. So thank you very much, and I look forward to speaking again soon about this topic. Have a nice day.
Ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes this panel. For those of you that don't know, there is a shift right now going on in the elections education world, I'll call it that, getting into the cyber influence activities space. In other words, the same way as in the past we would go to take courses in electoral observation or understanding electoral campaign finance. In the coming months, I'm sure you will start to see courses that are running in how to counter cyber influence activities. I know, and Alona's tracking this, International Center for Parliamentary Studies is working on this, OSCE is working on this. So we're all part of the same networks. We'll get that information. Canadians, we're inherently nice. It's just kind of the way we are. So the two esteemed colleagues will get their bottles of maple syrup. The people in the back know I'm going to do this, but the rest of you don't. We made a bet on who would be the first individual to actually offer a commentary or ask a question, and that first individual, whoever it would be, would get the third bottle of maple syrup. So if I can ask our esteemed colleague from Nepal to please come forward, well done. We'll see you at 4 o'clock next door.